All right, hello everyone, and welcome to Black Minds Matter. My name is Luke Wood, and I have the pleasure of serving as your professor for this course. Tonight we have a jam-packed schedule. We have some just incredible guest speakers who will be here. First, we'll have an interview here in live fashion with Dr. Nisha Savage. After that, we will have a guest lectureship and Q&A with Dr. Tyrone Howard, and then a video interviewee with Pedro Noguera. So it's about to be a wonderful evening for Black Minds. So tonight's topic is assumptions of criminality. And we're going to be talking about what that looks like. And so what I'm going to do is just provide some very quick framing and then move really out of the way so that we can get to our incredible guest speakers for the evening. So as always, we want to thank our sponsors who help us in putting on this course. This includes the Education Trust West, the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, Moms of Black Boys United, MOB, the San Diego State University Instructional Technology Services, Our Scholarship Matters, which provides us with apparel for the course, such as the shirt that I'm wearing right now, and the Center for Organizational Responsibility and Advancement, who provided actually a lot of the content for the lecture that I'm doing tonight. Okay, assumptions of criminality. Let's talk about what does that really mean. Now, the first session, we really devoted ourselves to talking about this, so I'm not going to belabor some of these points. But what I do want to do is at least recap and bring back to our mind some highlights from that session. Now, if you didn't see the video that I did on policing and schooling Black men, it's on youtube.com. Just go to that and watch that again, and that will give you some of the framing that you're missing from tonight. So assumptions of criminality is similarly a microaggression that's oftentimes experienced by our boys and men of color. It's when we assume a person of color is dangerous, criminal, or deviant based really on their race, and we're talking about Black boys and men on their race and their gender. So we know that oftentimes with this population that they are viewed in a way, and we talked about what some of those messages look like in terms of the ways that they're viewed as up to no good, as criminal, as nefarious, as troublesome, as a troublemaker. All these different words oftentimes come up in the minds of educators in terms of how they frame and then subsequently how they engage our Black boys and men. This relates to the concept of what we call the D3 effect. And if you remember, we talked about 3 different ways in which Black boys and men are viewed in society, right? The first D is distrust. That's where they are viewed as being deviant or up to no good. And again, that's the focus of today. Last week, we talked about the disregard, which really deals with the ways in which Black boys and Black men are viewed as academically inferior. And then there's also some cultural pathologizations where we oftentimes will disdain their cultures and their communities and the families in which they come from. So today is again focused on, again, this notion of distrust. So on your slide, you'll see a front cover for a peer-reviewed journal article that I did with my colleague, Adriel Hilton, called Moral Choices Towards a Conceptual Model of Black Male Moral Development. And in this article, if you want to check it out, it's available online. We talk about essentially the moralizing of Black boys and men and how they are framed. And we know that they are framed in ways that are typically not viewed as being moral. And so the framing is usually that they are at best amoral, meaning there's no real attribution as being either good or bad. And then also the second way is that they're viewed as immoral. Whereas when you look at other communities, there may be a range between being moral, amoral, and immoral depending upon the perceptions in society. But when we're talking about oftentimes how Black boys and men are framed in the media and in popular discourse, it's through this lens of being both amoral or immoral. So we see the manifestation of this in our work. In my work in research with Dr. Frank Harris, who served as a guest lecturer for this course, one of the things that he talked about is how our Black men are engaged on college campuses, really based upon our work in community colleges. Here's just some quotes to help paint the picture of what we're looking at. And these are some quotes from either what we've said about it, their experiences based upon our research, or what they've said themselves. Here's the first one. College men of color being followed around the campus bookstore to make sure they don't steal anything. is something that we've talked about in our work as a common pattern that they face. Checking the IDs of black men at nighttime to make sure they aren't on campus to steal something, vandalize, or hurt someone. Removing a black man from a classroom because he's communicating in a manner that's perceived to be aggressive or threatening. A teacher stepping backward when approached by a male of color after the class session has ended because of this ingrained notion that I've been taught to fear this person. Seeing a group of men of color and saying to them jokingly, "Oh, here comes trouble." Now, we oftentimes say things like that in our society. Oh, you know, we see a group of young men, oh, here comes trouble. But oftentimes what I've noticed, at least in my experience, is it's always the way that I'm framed, particularly if I'm going someplace with Dr. Harris, it is always like the common phrase that people use. And it makes me think, like, is there something more to that? Is it rooted in a joking kind of perspective? Or is it really alluding to some unconscious bias, and that's how they're seeing me, and then because that is a way that people sometimes joke with each other, that they will say that. And then not meeting with the black man in a closed environment, such as in the office, but keeping the door open for other students from other racial and ethnic groups, again, because of this notion of fear. Here's another quote, and this deals with this notion of being asked for your ID on campus. Last semester, I didn't have a car, so I had to stay on campus late after class until I could get a ride. What I would usually do is go and grab a bite to eat and then go to the library for a couple of hours to study. I can't tell you how many times I'd be sitting at one of the study cubicles and security would come to me and ask for my student ID. At first, I thought it was something that they did for everybody when it got late. But then I started to notice that they asked me for mine and did not ask anyone else for theirs. The last time it happened, I asked the officer, why did he need to see my ID? He said he had gotten some complaints about a guy who matches my description. Matches my description. And he needed to make sure I belonged here. After that, I stopped going because I did not want to get caught up in no mistaken identity type of, you can imagine what the word was. A 16-month-old Mexican-American child being given strikes. So this is an example that's not specifically to black males, but it's something that's come up in the literature. At a nursery for jumping. A parent being told their child of color is aggressive and doesn't listen when their behavior mirrors that of other children in class. And referring to two young boys who are highly active differently. One is energetic, while the other is defiant and hyperactive. Here's some quotes from the Our Voices project that my wife is involved in. And these are narratives from parents of children who are black children who are in early childhood. So here's some things they've said. My son is the only black child among his two close friends. When involved in an incident where the three boys were goofing off during class, my son was the only one to be sent to the principal's office by his teacher in first grade. That's an example of being singled out. Let's look at the next one. And these are different parents, by the way. My son's first grade teacher would call home for every little infraction. Some of the punishments were often severe for even a small thing, and it didn't match the quote-unquote crime, such as turning around in his seat one time would result in the whole day being marked bad. Some of the behavior issues that were written about would happen one time, and the teacher would prolong the punishment instead of dealing with it and moving on. It didn't feel like he got all the support he needed from his teacher that year. Let's look at another example. In first grade, my son's teacher yelled at him because he wouldn't put his head down. He called me and told me that I need to apply for Social Security for him and that he needs to be taken to see a mental health professional because there's something not clicking in his head. Just let those sit in for a moment. Here are some of the things that we're seeing in the research literature that's on this population. One, the research shows that they are singled out for punishment. Two, that there's an overregulation of minor innocuous infractions. Remember we talked about broken windows policing? It's like we can't let even the small things go. and in that way, they lose their childhood. They're misidentified when no wrongdoing has occurred. Well, they didn't do it, but you know, they're black, they're in that area, maybe it's them. To what we call reverse causality. And this is something that we've seen that the parents have talked about in that Our Voices study, where what they have seen is with their children, that their children are picked on, bullied, or disaffected, and they go and then they complain about it or say something about it. Then it's like reverse causality. Well, what did you do to cause it? What is it that you did that set in motion those events that took place? Being recipients of quicker punishments and harsher punishments. One thing that we've seen is being degraded and disrespected for perceived slights. So because we might be viewed in a dehumanized fashion, the response then is to degrade. It's to try to convey that we're unhappy, but doing it in a way that doesn't really build students up, but really serves to tear them down. And actions that are viewed through what we call a disorder-based lens. So a disorder-based lens is where, again, you saw in this quote, something's not clicking right in his head. He needs to go see a mental health professional. There must be something that's wrong in that way. Okay, so of course we want to get to, okay, so what can we do about this? What are some strategies and practices that work that we would call part of our Black Minds pedagogy? So the first is race consciousness. Being cognizant about race and racism at all times and how these factors influence individuals in the learning environment. You can see on the screen there's a book cover, and a lot of these recommendations are from a book that I did with my colleague, Dr. Frank Harris, called Teaching Boys and Young Men of Color, a Guidebook. Recommendations from teachers with a record of success in educating Black and Latino males. So one of the things they recommended was being race conscious. You have to be aware of race. You can't ignore it. So part of that is engaging in training. We've talked about the importance of engaging in training in unconscious bias and training on microaggressions. In fact, this week, on Wednesday, I'll be at the U.S. Department of Education doing a training on unconscious bias. It's important for us to be able to engage in every space with classroom educators and those who are in government to really say, you know, we have to be aware of what's going on. Review your referrals and disciplinary data. Look to see, are there disparities in how it's playing out in your individual classroom, in your school, in the program that you're in your university, in your college. Look at the data and see if there's some differences. And if so, we have to ask ourselves, are those differences a function of behavior, or are those differences a function of bias? And then being proactively reject deficits and fears of Black minds. We have to be cognizant of it. So race consciousness. Next thing we talk about is moralizing practices. And that's ensuring that the curriculum, examples, and discussions are culturally relevant while also proactively affirming the morality and inherent dignity of Black minds. So here's some ways we can do that. Presenting Black boys and men in moralized ways. If we talk about the examples, we talked about this last time, that we give in our classroom, it would be important for us to provide examples that present the subject matter, if we're bringing in culturally relevant subject matter, that presents them in moralized ways. And last week we talked about presenting them in ways that demonstrate their intelligence and abilities, but in moralized ways. So think about, what are some professions, right, that might be associated with servanthood, might be viewed as moral professions or selfless professions? Well, those are some of the examples we should be pulling in. Rejecting deficits and fears in class discussion. So what does that mean? If someone says something in class that is untoward or racist or unconsciously biased, our job is to confront that and say something about it. Say that, hey, that's not right. And then to present an alternative perspective. We have to hold our colleagues accountable for their conversations and engagement. This is a concept that's associated with equity-mindedness. We hear colleagues talking about our students in a certain way that's kind of negative. What do we want to do? Well, we want to say, that's not right, and point it out to them. Hold each other accountable. Positively message narratives about black boys and men. At the same time, while we hold our colleagues accountable, we need to be thoughtful about the ways that we talk about our boys. We don't want to ever say that a child, for example, is bad, right? He's a bad kid, or he behaves badly, right? That's not the kind of way that we want to talk about them. We want to talk about them in moralized ways. Again, if the notion, the master narrative is that they're presented as being immoral or amoral, our job as equity-minded educators who take responsibility is to do the opposite and message the opposite message. Next, use non-confrontational tones. The language employed should be calm, non-hostile, and respectful. So this is inclusive of what we say and, most importantly, what we do. We have to remember that when we're talking about our black boys and men, they oftentimes feel marginalized and uncared for. So to use a confrontational tone with them will only serve to reify the experiences that they've already had. Moreover, they'll then begin to view our interactions with them and pull back in all those experiences that they've had where they've been treated with disrespect. So what you'll find sometimes is if you use a confrontational tone, the response is for them to be very sharp back or to even escalate it further. Why? Because one, there's a desire to protect their identity and their integrity, but they're also filtering those experiences through other experiences that they've had. And those experiences are experiences with disrespect. Allow for a fresh start. Treat each day as a new day. Particularly when we're talking about K-12, we're talking about kids. And we talked about in our last session or 2 sessions ago that that this population loses their youthfulness. They lose the right to be a child, to make mistakes, to be viewed as innocent, to be viewed as being in need of care. So we have to do the opposite. We got to give them a fresh start. If one day is bad, you know what? The next day will be better. So here's a quote from a teacher who was in our book that we talked about, where we talked about exemplars, and this is one of the things they said. Each day is a new day. Unfortunately, there's a stigma that follows boys of color throughout their school careers, especially if they've had discipline issues in the past. Some will have reputations that precede them. I tell my students that each day is a new day. You may have done yesterday, what you may have done yesterday has nothing to do with how you were treated by me today. Each day is a new opportunity to do better. We don't want eventually for students to begin to see themselves as bad, because you know it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, again, this notion of losing innocence is important. If they've lost innocence, then what happens is we oftentimes will treat them like men, right? A man who makes mistakes is perceived as knowing better and thus deserving of more rigorous punishment and not immediately deserving of forgiveness. But if we view them as being the age that they are, not younger than and not older than, but what they are, we'll view it as a person who makes a mistake. It's funny, I say mistake and mistake is spelt wrong. It's merely seen as a kid who is learning. Critique privately, praise publicly. Provide critiques of their performance and actions in private. So if there's something that we have to tell them that's not necessarily about them doing well, either academically in terms of behavior, or we want to do that privately. But if they do something well, we want to praise that publicly. Public praise promotes self-confidence. It's important for them to be praised publicly. But we got to remember, and Dr. Harris talked about this in his session, boys are socialized to want to maintain a sense of pride and control. So if you degrade them in public, you should expect that it's not going to produce the kind of outcome that you're looking for. Instead, pull them aside. Ask to speak with them after class. If it's during class and it really requires some sort of conversation, go over and speak with them quietly. But most important of all, no one else should know the nature of that conversation. They should have no idea what you're talking with them about. Allow them to maintain their dignity. And here's some things that teachers said about this. Speak with individuals personally, away from the group, to help them save face and lessen the risk of expanding the issue to whole group situations. Public reprimand generally results in shutdown, disengagement, or disrespect. Quiet reprimand and public praise works consistently. So those are just a few recommendations. And at this point, we're going to proceed, and Karan, if you can help us get set up. We're going to proceed to our first guest speaker. Our first guest speaker is Dr. Nisha Savage. Dr. Nisha Savage is currently serving as the Acting Dean of Student Development and Matriculation at San Diego City College. Nisha brings over 10 years of experience in providing leadership oversight for student success programs, such as first-year experience coordinator and director of TRIO programs. She served as the department chair of counseling and personal growth for 4 years. This experience provided her with the knowledge and skills needed to support student development and matriculation programs. Nisha is an active participant on various campus initiatives, work groups, and committees responsible for improving student services and instruction for students. Dr. Savage is the founder of Hermanos Unidos, Brothers United, HUBU, as we affectionately call it, which focuses on improving the success of men of color, and along with Dr. Frank Harris III and Luke Wood, Dr. Savage established the Parker Scholars Program at San Diego City College, which serves students who have been formerly incarcerated, otherwise known as students who are returning citizens. And so what I'm going to do is remind you that we are using the hashtag Black Minds Matter. So if you have questions for Dr. Savage, please send them to us. I'm also going to put down her Twitter handle, which is at NSAV. She has by far the most straightforward Twitter handle I've ever seen. So win on that. Let's move forward a little bit more. Okay, so can you begin by telling the audience, the students who are here and those who are joining us virtually about yourself?
So the Parker Scholars Program, which is now called the City Scholars Program, Parker's was the funding source, the foundation that we got funded to have the City Scholars Program, which is a program for our formerly incarcerated students. And so as the Acting Dean of Student Development, that program is one of the programs that is under me. So aside from helping to bring it to the college, I'm actually now being able to be more actively involved in how it's ran and making program improvements to the program.
Okay, thank you, thank you. So how did you get into work in terms of the work that you're doing with those who are returning citizens? And that word, returning citizens, I've got it from our colleague Carlito Sanchez. And so do you want to talk about some of that?
Well, so as you know, we at City College, we really are a campus that's about social justice. Like that's just who we are, is a part of our culture. And so really we're always sort of looking at ways of how to support all of our students. And so the work that we were doing for men of color in general through HUBU, kind of gave way to, looking at, well, what does that population look like? And so we found that we have a lot of students that were already in our classroom that were formerly incarcerated. And so we needed to figure out how to support them because their needs are extremely unique. And so, then, of course, I had the opportunity to work with you and Frank, and you all reached out to us, and thankfully, and we collaborated on writing a proposal to get funded for the program. And I want to be specific about what we did. It's not like we just wrote a grant proposal. We were intentional about the treatments that we wanted for the program. So we looked at the data, we looked at the research, we looked at literature, and looked at best practices to find out like what are some of, we made assumptions based on that, what are some of the strategies or program treatments that we could have to support our students.
So in doing that research, you learned about challenges, so then
Right.
the program could then provide supports for those challenges.
Right.
What are some of the common challenges that they face?
Well, so, and I would actually like to speak about it in terms of like, specific to the challenges that our students at City have shared. So we're actually going through the process right now of evaluating our program. We're going to have a student panel where we're inviting our students in, and we're going to actually just ask them, like, what are the challenges that you face, so that we can hear right from them, what are the challenges, what has worked, what has not worked, and we're just really, right now trying to make improvements so that we can better support that population. And so I can just tell you that some of the challenges that we know of right now, it's just, with re-entering. I mean, they have to balance the requirements that we're requiring them, being a college student, and then the requirements of work, because a lot of them, are breadwinners for their family, and then also, too, the requirements that their parole officers and their probation officers have on them. So some of these men, they're in rehab, and they have to do testing, and they have to report. And so if we're having like a HUBU conference, and we're like, well, we need you to go to the HUBU conference, and it's after class, but then they have to go to testing, it's like they have to learn how to juggle those things. So some of the challenges are juggling being a college student while also having to meet the requirements that are set by their parole officers and their probation officers. And the truth is the parole officers and the probation officers, their priority isn't necessarily school. They want these men to go to work. And so, one of the things that, if we really want to be progressive and do things differently, we really should look at how, to do like a social work model for counselors that are at our institution. How can we go and work with the parole officers and the probation officers and the student to create a plan? Because the students are given plans through their parole officers and probation officers. This is what you're going to do each day, type thing. And so if we work with them to kind of insert some of the things that we want, that not necessarily that we want, but that students have shared with us, that these are the things that we want to do, like tutoring, like going to, university field trips, stuff like that, that, the parole officer might not think is very significant, but the student, because now he's a college student, sees the value in it, and of course we understand the value of it, but how can we get the parole officer and the probation officers to see the value in it so that they will create a plan that supports them being able to participate in those types of activities?
Okay, thank you. So I'd also like to add a little bit to that in terms of some of the challenges that I've seen. So, I come to, this work from the community college perspective, both as a practitioner and someone who does research on community colleges. And so, the wider literature talks about the school to prison pipeline. And we've talked about that in this class, how identified for special education, exposed to exclusionary discipline, tracked into the prison industry. But it doesn't necessarily end there for a lot of our men. And so what we talk about is the school to prison to school pipeline, because when they get out on the other side, they're not going to the university, they're typically going to a community college. And so when I began at Sacramento City College, which was the first place that I ever worked, I was doing work primarily with those who are formerly incarcerated. I was going to the prison release and talking with guys and then bringing them onto campus. That's what I was doing in terms of that work. And so I learned some of the challenges that they faced. Some of it was in terms of perception. You have guys who are on campus, and you have sometimes faculty members who are like, I don't know if I really want to work with this student. I feel uncomfortable. We had programs in some cases that didn't want to necessarily admit a large number of those who were formerly incarcerated because they were worried about, okay, but if we do this, will it hurt the reputation of our program and then mar the opportunities that we've created in industry for the other students that we're serving? And which is, an understandable concern. Another thing that I saw that was a pretty pervasive pattern is that these guys would come out and they would have no money. They would be out, they would be trying to figure out how can I move forward, and I have nothing. I have nothing. I'm homeless. I'm sleeping on someone's couch. I'm from place to place. I had guys who were living out of their backpacks practically. And I'm trying just to do school. And so there's a lot of factors that challenge them. But you found some things as part of the program that are some interventions that work. What are some of those interventions?
Yeah, so as I shared, like we really are committed to doing a better job of assessing just that. And like listening to our students, what are they saying? Because again, we can make assumptions based on what we know through the research and the literature, but really finding out from a practical standpoint, like what are the things that we can implement to better support them. And so, you know, I mentioned the whole balancing work, school, and the requirements of their parole and probation officer. So work is real. I mean, you know, for our men, they have to support themselves, and financial challenges are a challenge for majority of our community college students, but even more specifically for, you know, our formerly incarcerated students. And so one of the things that we did through the Parker's grant is we wrote in a stipend. And so because we understood that finances would be a challenge, especially if they're having to, you know, figure out the competing, you know, school requirements and then their work requirements. Like we wanted to make that an easier choice for them by trying to relieve some of that stress. So financial aid might not be available to some of them because of their background. So we put the stipend in, and so we were able to get that for students. But of course, you know, you have to have funding or a funding source to sustain something like that. So in the absence of that, what we're doing is trying to have workshops that talks about financial planning and financial advising, and really some other things that we're wanting to do more of is workshop type things, but during the hours that they would be normally in class. Because again, until we're able to figure out how to get the parole officers and probation officers to support them to do things outside of the classroom, meaning like you're not scheduling them to go have to report in or test right after their class ends, because you know you're literally clocking every minute of their day. But some things that we need to do, because there's basic things that these men really just don't know, like basic computer skills. You know, what is a flash drive, how to print, how to type. You know, so if we have more workshops that we could provide to the students, I think that we are setting them up for success in that way. Because if in a class setting, let's just say the student is in an English class and the teacher's like, okay, I want you guys to type this paper. We can give them tutoring all day long, but if they can't even really, you know, if they don't really understand how to type or how to navigate the internet, you know, to research, then, you know, they're going to struggle. And in most cases, like, you know, men of color, they're not going to speak out and say, you know, I need help. And so what we find really is it's hard even getting them to come to City, to come to college, because they're like, well, what is there for me? I can't get financial aid. And then what's going to happen afterward? Because, you know, because of my background, am I going to get a job? So, you know, we need to start promoting when we're doing our outreach efforts, be intentional about what we're highlighting so that those students understand that we have a place for you here, and that, you know, there are opportunities for you. And let me highlight those opportunities. You don't just have to go into AODS. Like there's other occupations that are available to you, and make it something like that they, you know, that they feel like that there's a place for them here, and that it's not for nothing, you know. And so so doing that would work. Doing more. So
how do you get people on board to do that?
I mean, you just coordinate it. You know, if you have a program, you know, you make it a part of the program. A part of the program requirements that you're doing those types. So we do workshops now. I'm just saying, you know, we need to, you know, after hearing from the students exactly what types of workshops they want, we need to start making more of those workshops. And then, you know, we also need to work with the parole officers and the probation officers, because we can't really hold a workshop when they're in class. So these things have to happen after class. So we need to make sure that they're not being clocked for time, like right after class, they have to go report. Like, can we give them some space so that they can stay and engage on campus and really benefit from these workshops and field trips, university field trips and things like that.
Okay. So what we're going to do is turn to some questions. And the first question actually comes from Kevin Christian, who is head of diversity for the American Association of Community Colleges. And he said this, he says, many community colleges really would like to engage in this work. However, they face issues concerned about liability and compliance, and most just don't have the capacity to make this effort successful on all fronts. What suggestions or advice would you have for colleges that need to convince their board, their president, or upper level administration that this work is not only beneficial to the college, but beneficial to the community as a whole?
So, you know, the City Scholars is a program that are for students who are not, you know, who are formerly incarcerated. We do actually do some work with a juvenile correctional center where we're offering hybrid courses. And so luckily, and you know, it's a blessing, I work for a district and, you know, specifically a college that we are about social justice. So people get it. Like, we are constantly trying to look for ways to, you know, be innovative and have different programs for students who come from marginalized groups. And so, you know, luckily we didn't really have to fight with people to get them to support, you know, this work. But I do understand that that is, you know, a reality, and it's real for people. Some people might say, well, you know, I'm assuming when you say liability, you might be talking about safety issues. But the truth are, you know, these students are already in your class, whether they identify themselves as formerly incarcerated or not. They are sitting in your class right now. And so, you know, and really, you know, for community college, we're about access and opportunities for everybody. So it shouldn't matter a person's background or where they come from. Your job is to, you know, to teach students who come from all different kinds of backgrounds. So I feel fortunate to work for a college like City College where people get it, and so we've never really had to have that fight.
Okay. So this question comes from Terry Sivers, who's a student in the physical class, and he says, are there differences and limitations and experiences of Black men versus white men who have a record?
I do think that there are differences, and so just like what you were talking about, I think, you know, there's these stigmas and messages and negative messages and narratives that portray Black men as criminals. You know, they don't value the lives of Black men. That's why you can see all the police brutality and just, you know, killing innocent Black men. So, you know, you can safely assume that those same narratives and those same perceptions absolutely make its way into the classroom. And so the teachers they're already starting out, you know, with the teachers making assumptions about their academic ability and you know, and them being criminal and you know, and such. And so, you know, that might not be the case for a white male student, because you would probably see that student as, you know, it's give him a second chance. Look at him, he's in college. You would approach it from a positive standpoint as opposed to what you would for a Black man.
Okay. This next question comes from Moms of Black Boys United, and they say, are there ways to fix the assumptions of criminality in our educational system?
Yeah. I mean, you can start by requiring, like, folks who are educators and who are, you know, interfacing with these men, teach them how to engage with the men in the classroom. You know, if you have assumptions, become aware of them. You know, have professional development opportunities where you have the students speak to faculty, and they really need to confront the implicit biases that they have and be real and say that I do think this way. And so, you know, because the truth is these men constantly are dealing with messages and messaging that says that you're an offender. I mean, we call them offenders and felons. So they come to us already with those messages. And so it's our job to teach them that you are a contributor. You are a part of this community. We need you here. We value you. So educators, we have to learn that that is our role. So the student sitting in the back that might be formerly incarcerated, he might expect that you're not going to call on him because of the messages that he's been receiving. You need to be aware of that coming in so that you're intentionally calling on them, so that you make them feel, you draw them in, you engage them so that they feel that they're a part of that classroom.
This next question comes from DeMarcus Merritt. He says, I feel like high schools have more law enforcement officers now than guidance counselors. Any thoughts on this?
It's sad. We don't, you know, I work in community college, so we don't have any, well, we actually have campus police. But again, our campus police, we just, at the San Diego Community College District, I think folks just kind of get it. Like, you're the odd man if you're acting out in a way that's, discriminating or treating, students differently. And so I think it's sad, because the reality is that we do know that counseling is a huge part of helping students be successful, because teachers are teaching the subject, but it's those, non-cognitive things that counselors are able to really work with the men and help them grapple with how to, deal with anger, in a healthy way, how to deal with stress in a healthy way. A police officer can't have that conversation, so we need more counselors.
Well, at least not in the same way.
Well, right.
Okay, this next question comes from Hasna Saddah, who's a student in the physical class. How could we create promising and lucrative career pathways for our students who have been formerly incarcerated without being stigmatized and limited in terms of career options? Ooh, that's a loaded question.
Yeah, that is. Okay, so we are partnering with Urban League of San Diego. And one of the things that Urban League, what they've done is they've actually created a database of all of the occupations that students who have records, but they can pursue. And so, so knowing what those occupations are, just like I said in the beginning, promoting those occupations to when we're doing our outreach, because we actually go to like the juvenile community court schools, which is now known as Momentum Learning. So when we go out there, we're outreaching and trying to encourage these men to come to our campus. We're sharing with them, here's a list of all of the occupations that you can pursue. And then we actually we have a Title V grant at City College where it's all about curriculum redesign. And so there's great opportunities there to create programs that don't have these limitations. And in addition to that, we have the Strong Workforce grant in California. And so there's a ton of opportunities there to really look at career options for students and being creative and being innovative in how we develop those programs so that we again, provide access and not barriers for our students who are coming to us with backgrounds.
So, so many questions coming in at this point. What I'm going to say is, Dr. Savage, I hope that you can engage some of these on Twitter, because it's filling up pretty quickly here. I'm just going to do one more because we're going to move forward. But this is from Dr. Kyle Williams. He says, how are you able to identify and create a space for these young men to feel comfortable in sharing this so we can support them? Right. Because if you don't know, you can't support, but at the same time, if you know, then you might see them differently. So how do you deal with that complexity?
Well, so that was one of the reasons why when we created the City Scholars Program, we made personal growth like the core class. It was a huge part of, it was the core of the program. It was the heart of the program, because it was supposed to serve as sort of a homeroom where there's a counselor there, where you can actually really get into some deep conversations about what the men are dealing with on a personal level, and not so much on the academic level. And so if we have personal growth classes where they have a counselor that they're working with, they can have these conversations that can even extend beyond the classroom, because that's their counselor. So sort of like what we do with the Emotion No Puente program, we have a counselor that's assigned to the students who teach the personal growth class. And so those students literally start to see those personal growth instructors as their mom and dad away from home. And so, they're more likely to share, because you're building community. You're with them 16 weeks, sometimes multiple days out of the week. So there's opportunities for trust to be built. And once they trust, then they'll speak out. But I'll tell you, one thing that I've learned about this population is that advocacy is huge for them. Like, we have a student organization on our campus that is very active. And it's an organization that's made up of all of our not all of them, but our formerly incarcerated students. And so they're doing a lot of community activism, because that is how we engage them on the campus. That's huge for them. More than anything else that we can come up with, providing a space where they can be amongst each other, advocating and feel like they're contributing and that they're doing something to pave the way for others to bring, others that are coming behind them, is huge. And so if we have the counseling piece, which we need to do, make sure that that's a huge part of whatever effort we're doing. And if you could do a personal growth class, because that's time that you'll have a captured audience, and you can cap the class of whatever you want it to, so that it's small enough where folks are more likely to open up and share.
Okay. Well, let's give her a round of applause. Thank you for coming. So again, Dr. Savage is on Twitter at InSav. So please feel free to continue to engage her. She'll be here throughout the rest of the broadcast. So for the students who are in class, you'll get a chance to ask her some questions individually. For those who are joining us online, get at her through Twitter. At this point, we'd like to go ahead and move on to our next guest speaker. And while Kron is getting everything set up with that, I'm going to go ahead and read his bio. Our next speaker is Professor Tyrone Howard. He's a professor at the University of California, Los Angeles in the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies. He is also the director and founder of the Black Male Institute, which is an interdisciplinary cadre of scholars, practitioners, community members, and policymakers dedicated to improving the educational experiences and life chances of Black males. He was also the director of Center X for the past 7 years, which was a consortium of urban school professionals working towards social justice and educational equity in transforming Los Angeles schools. Beyond this, Dr. Howard is one of the most important, impactful, insightful, prolific scholars you will ever meet. His work has really helped to shape this field in ways that have advanced ideas and theory into real on-the-ground practice and change. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Howard.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. First, before I start, I want to tell all the folks out there that I hope the folks down in San Diego realize how much of a jewel you have in Professor Wood. He is truly a game changer in more ways than one. So I just want to say thank you, Dr. Wood, for all that you do and the important work that you're doing. It is truly game changing in more ways than I can articulate. And I want to say I appreciate being here. But my work, my interest in this really comes from my own upbringing. I oftentimes tell my students that I think so much of research is tied to me-search, our own personal experiences, our own lived realities. And so for me, growing up as a young Black boy in Compton and just seeing so many of my peers who were Black males who just did not get the same kinds of opportunities that I had, who were oftentimes, you know, sort of stifled in their growth and their creativity and their innovation. And so you wonder how much lost human potential, how much intellect did we lose because young Black boys were not given the space and the ability to grow and thrive and learn and love. And so it came from my own upbringing and also manifested through my own years as a classroom teacher, teaching in Compton and seeing the same thing happening where young Black boys just were not being recognized for their full humanity. So, and then it also translated to me being a father of 3 Black sons and seeing some of the things that happened to them, even as their father, and their mother, both of us having, you know, advanced degrees, still having to fight the same battles, still engaging in the same fights every single day. And the thing that oftentimes jumped out for me is that if my sons go through this and they've got parents who've got all the social capital that we say that supposedly matters, what does it mean for those Black boys out there who don't have mothers and fathers and caretakers and caregivers who know how to navigate these structures and these institutions called schools?
Yeah, I mean, I can personally relate to that as well as being a father, having three children, and we face the same challenges that we research. We might have a better understanding of what's taking place, but it's the same patterns that take place. Can you talk about some of the work that you've done in advocating against zero tolerance policies, explaining, you know, what that is, how they adversely affect Black boys, and some of the work that you've done to really kind of, you know, push against those policies?
Yeah, so this all comes back again, Dr. Wood, to I spent a lot of time in schools, and one of the things that consistently jumped out at me, no matter what type of school I would go to, small school, large school, public school, private school, is this notion of Black boys being in the office. And that always sort of bothered me. Why is it that I'm at a school that has a 5% Black population, but there's, you know, nothing but Black boys in the office? And so part of my work around working with teachers is why is it do we see this constant what I call exporting of Black boys out of learning spaces? We say schools are supposed to be inclusive spaces where we want young people to learn, but Black boys are seemingly always being pushed out of those spaces. And as I started to dig deeper into that, And I did that not by always talking to teachers, but I talked to many of the young boys themselves. All the time, the young boys would say things like, I was just being me. I was just having a conversation. I was just asking a question. I was just trying to clarify what it was we were supposed to do. Or I got sent because I had a dress violation, because I had something on my shirt I wasn't supposed to have. And so what I began to recognize is that there was a pattern of these really asinine, minuscule ways of being that teachers were looking for opportunities just to push black boys out. I don't want you in my class. I don't want you in my presence. I don't want you in the space. And part of what I oftentimes say is that when you tell any group of students over and over and over again that they're a problem, as the boy says, they begin to think, you know what, then I must be a problem. And then it goes to the point where if I think I'm a problem, now guess what? I'm going to act as if I'm a problem. And so I think it all is rooted in this ideology around anti-blackness that's also sort of coupled with anti-boyness. And so you take those two realities together, and black boys are public enemy number one in so many schools across this country for no other reason than the fact that they are black and male. And that's a big problem.
But you've advocated against this and have seen some success in that and really raising this as an issue, right? These policies and how they, and not just policies, but the practices themselves, right?
Right, because what we see is not just policies, it's practices, and it's also ideologies. And so what we start with is we ask schools to take a look at their data primarily around suspensions, the data around expulsions, the data around referrals. And oftentimes you'd have principals and teachers say, well, no, we don't unfairly target any group or any population. But my thing has always been the numbers don't lie. Look at the numbers that you report in your school as it's broken down by race and ethnicity and gender, and you begin to see that how can you have a school population that's 20% African American, yet 80% of the kids who are suspended are black boys. A school that's 50% African American, but 90% of the population are black children. So my thing is the numbers don't lie, and once you start to acknowledge the numbers, now you have to come to grips with the fact that you have a problem. And the problem is rooted in the fact that people are oftentimes unaware, unconscious, they might claim, but we're very clear about the fact that you watch the ways in which certain kind of pedagogical approaches systematically and intentionally and unapologetically often target black boys in ways that sort of depicts them as the problem.
Wow. So for administrators, so the first thing it sounds like you would tell them to do is start out with your data, figure out where those gaps are, and then really engage in some sense making to understand what's contributing to them. Anything else that you would tell an administrator that they really need to be focused on as it relates to these issues? Yeah,
so I tell administrators, start with your numbers, because the data tells you, let me back up. First of all, most administrators know who the teachers are, who are the primary culprits of criminalizing black boys. They may not want to acknowledge it, so start with your data. Then you have to go to the next step of saying, okay, we have to have some difficult conversations. Show the data in front of all your staff and ask your staff to make sense out of it. I've been in some of those meetings, Dr. Wood, and those meetings are full of pointing the finger, the blame game. These kids don't have, these boys are a problem, these boys are disruptive. Yet and still, when I talk to some of the boys, when we talk to some of the boys, what they would oftentimes tell us is that they just engage in some of the same behavior that their white male counterparts or their white girl counterparts engage in, but they don't get dealt with in the same way. And so I think administrators have to have these hard conversations with their staffs, and then they have to go spend some time in those classrooms and watch how teachers sit black boys at the back of the class, turn them away from the learning environments. Or they just have this, what I call this perpetual surveillance on black boys. Don't move, don't breathe, don't sneeze, don't do anything that young boys or young children do. And that becomes a problem. They become hyper surveilled, they become hyper scrutinized, they can't be themselves. And I think that becomes part and parcel of the problem.
So, okay, so let's bring it down now to teachers, right? So you'll have some of those who are absolutely the clear culprits, but you also have some of those who unconsciously, they do the same things as well, maybe not to the same extent. So even thinking about both those kind of populations, if you're sitting down and you're doing, because you do a lot of talking to teachers, what do you tell them?
Yeah, so part of it, what I explain to teachers is that understand that we all have implicit bias. And implicit bias doesn't make you a bad person. Implicit bias makes you a human. And so part of the implicit bias, unconscious bias framework tells us that we have all heard and been exposed to these negative, nasty stereotypes about black boys and black men. And if we're not conscious of that, we buy into that ideology and we're not even aware of it. And I always say this, that this is not only something that white teachers do to black boys. Teachers of color are also equally guilty at times. Black teachers sometimes are guilty at times because there's a long sordid history of how we see black men, black boys as being subhuman, black boys, black men as being prone to violence, black boys, black men as being oftentimes criminal in their intent, and all that stuff sort of filters in the air. And unless we are very cognizant of it, of how it is informing and influencing everything we do in terms of where we tell black boys to sit, in terms of how they respond to questions, in terms of how they play, in terms of how they laugh, in terms of how they think, all these things get sort of looked at through this lens of problem, this lens of disruptive, this lens of sort of pathology. And if you don't bring that to the surface, you think you're doing right by children, because some of the most destructive teachers I see would say that they're the most fair-minded and the most loving teachers around. And I oftentimes refer to these teachers as sympathetic destroyers of black boys' dreams, because what they don't realize is that they're in their sympathy, they have lowered the standard of expectations. They see black boys through this lens of pathology, and they continue to engage in this sort of exclusion, if you will, from the learning process of black boys. And like I said, it's a hard conversation. It's a necessary conversation, but you can go to virtually any school, Dr. Wood, and to the rest of the class, and you can ask black boys who those teachers are. And they can tell you just like that, because they have interacted with them. Oftentimes, they deliberately do things that will get them taken out of those classrooms, which I think is a stroke of genius. Why should I remain in the place where someone's being hostile to me, right? Why should I remain in the face of a teacher who I know does not have my best interest at heart? And why should I be in a place that I know where my humanity is not being affirmed? So young boys as young as 5 and 6 years old can tell you who these teachers are. And then our young men who are 15, 16, 17 years old can tell you who these young men. And I'll go one step further, because these folks also exist on college campuses. Yep. Undergraduate students, graduate students can also tell you who these folks are as well.
Wow, that's powerful. Sympathetic destroyers of black boys' dreams. Wow. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's step back away from necessarily the educators and administrators and talk about it more full circle, looking at parents. What are some of the things that parents can do to better advocate for their children, recognizing that they will be going into institutions where they're going to be seen in these ways? And the reason I ask is one of our partners for this course is Moms of Black Boys United. Mm-hmm. And so they're a large network of parents, and there's a lot of parents who are watching. What do you tell them?
Yeah, so let me be frank. Part of what I oftentimes say, and I say this as someone who, again, is a parent of 4 children, 3 boys, do not assume good intentions when it comes to how schools see your black boys. And that sounds awful to say as an educator, but you cannot assume good intentions, because what will happen is if you make that assumption, you get sort of led down a road that I think is oftentimes more destructive than we realize. So what parents have got to do is they've got to be vocal, you've got to be present, and you've got to always be prepared to make moves where you are prepared to take your child out of a classroom, and in some cases out of a school. So I think that we have to change the way we think about how education works. Years ago, parents thought it was my job to just drop my children off, and schools, because they had good intentions, would do right by my son. I don't think that they no longer exist any longer. Now you have to go in assuming that if I'm not vocal and present and vigilant, that things may happen to my child that cannot be undone. Labeling, sort of the ways in which they are sort of having their confidence taken from them. So parents have got to be involved. You got to be involved at school site council meetings. You got to be at PTO, PTA meetings. And the main thing you can do is talk to your sons, because they will tell you more than I think you may want to know, but I think it's what you need to know. Because like I said a moment ago, our children know what's going on. They know when they are not being given the same opportunities to learn. They may not know how to articulate it. They may not have the language when they're young, but when they begin to express something that doesn't feel quite right, we need to show up. We need to ask questions. We need to demand excellence. And that means sometimes having a conversation with the teacher, having a conversation with the administrator, or sitting in that classroom for a half an hour or for 45 minutes just to observe. As a taxpaying citizen, if your child's in a public school, you have a right to be in your child's classroom. If you're in a private school, you pay every month. You have a right to be in that classroom. My thing is watch, observe, listen, and you begin to understand that what our sons and what our nephews, what our grandsons, what our young boys are telling us, it's not all made up. this is rooted in a reality that boys are encountering every single day in schools all across this country, yet we typically sort of sweep it under the rug as if they are making these things up, as if they are somehow not really experiencing this. And I think if we continue to do so, I think we're making a big mistake.
Okay. At this point, we're going to transition to allowing questions to come in from externally for those who are either in the classroom or those who are live streaming. In addition, I want to point out that your Twitter handle is at Tyrone C. Howard, at Tyrone C. Howard. So if you want to basically hit him directly on Twitter, you can do that. But again, we're using the hashtag Black Minds Matter. So that's where we'll be taking the questions from in terms of where we'll get the questions for Dr. Howard. So the first one is sometimes, you know, single parents might not be able to be as involved as they would like to be in terms of pushing against the school. Any recommendations on how they might do that more strategically with the limited time?
Yeah, so I always make the argument that it's not about family composition that matters. It's about family disposition. So even as a single parent or a grandparent or a foster parent, if you cannot physically be present, the wonders of technology allow us to be present in more ways than we can ever be before. Send a text message, send an email. Many teachers have a course website where you can post and have individual comments that way. Send a message with your child, telling that child that I want this message to be passed on to the teacher, and say, I need you to contact me, right? And be persistent, right? So I think that what we have to recognize, a lot of the literature says that the most engaged parents are Asian American parents. And many of those parents oftentimes rarely show up at school, but they stay engaged by making sure they have lines of communication open between themselves and the educators who are given the responsibility of teaching their children.
Absolutely. So here's another question. It comes from a student in our class, Terry, who says, should our fight for access in education also include a simultaneous fight for curriculum change?
Yes, because one of the reasons we know our young boys disengage is because they are oftentimes having to deal with curriculum that is not culturally or racially or socially responsive to their needs, to their experiences, and to their worldviews. And so, again, I think it's a stroke of genius if you've got a young boy who tells you, a young man tells you, why do I need to bother reading about Johnny Appleseed? There's nobody named Johnny in my neighborhood, and there definitely aren't any apple trees in my neighborhood. So why does that relate to me, right? I think we have to be able to think about equity and inclusion in the larger sense, but also in the curricular sense, in the pedagogical sense, in the assessment sense. With all that we do, we have to think about how we transform schools to be more affirming of who our young people are.
Absolutely, absolutely. Again, we're taking questions via the hashtag Black Minds Matter, and you can use the tag Tyrone C. Howard, or you can hit us directly. So this next question comes from, I don't see one, it comes from me. So you've written a lot, right? You have and this is a kind of, I guess, a scholarly geeky question. Is there a piece that really stands out in your mind, like, wow, I feel like I really contributed something powerful with this piece? I mean, we all have ones that we tend to be more, you know, have more affinity towards than others. Is there any particular one for you that stands out?
You know, you can't ask that question, Dr. Wood. That's like asking which one of your children is your favorite child, right? You love them all, right? No, but you know, I would say that there's a piece that I wrote that is called Hearing Footsteps in the Dark. And the reason why that piece really sort of stands out in my mind, because I'm big on student voice in my work. I believe that we don't do enough work around student voice. And to me, that piece on student voice is one of the real key pieces that really helped me to understand the real power and the real sort of precision upon which a lot of our young people are able to speak their truths, speak their realities, and how they can speak truth to power. And so really that piece that I wrote probably over 10 years ago became really the real catalyst for why I decided to do the work I did with Black Mailed, and why I did a couple other pieces around black boys, because it's like, you know, young people when empowered with the ability to speak their truth without being edited, without being filtered, can tell us some really powerful things. And I think that one of the things that worries me is that in this education debate, education reform discussion, we talk to university folks, we talk to researchers, we talk to practitioners, we even talk to lawmakers who don't know a whole lot about education. We talk to a whole lot of folks involved in the education process, but it just seems to me a bit remiss that we don't talk to young people, the very people who are the ones who are supposedly most at play here in terms of receiving what we're doing. So I think that if we're going to have real, authentic, honest school reform discussions, young people need to be front and center in that conversation, because they're the ones who are living it. They're the ones who are telling us what's working, what's not working. And I always say this, I think there's a reason why oftentimes we don't want to hear from young people, is because we're afraid to hear what they might tell us, because what they might tell us could be a significant indictment on those of us who say that we really care about what happens in schools, especially on behalf of our most marginalized populations, of which Black boys are definitely one of them.
Absolutely. We got a couple more questions that came in. This one comes from Ms. Beacon. She says, how should educators ensure that their fellow coworkers don't engage in implicit bias without criticizing their teaching style? That's the question.
Yeah, I think it's important that we just start having conversation with our colleagues, because even our colleagues know who the folks are who aren't doing this work right. And again, I always say this when I talk to teachers, that if you participate or you engage in implicit bias, not engaging, but if you sort of show the manifestations of implicit bias, it doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you human. And I think when we begin to do that, we have to talk about the practices and the expectations and the beliefs that some teachers have around Black boys. And I think that teachers have got to be bold and got to be courageous. I mean, part of, I hope, what I tell teachers all the time, I hope you're not in this because you want your coworkers to be your friends. I would hope that you do this because you want to do the work that's best for the children that you serve. And that's the term I use, that you serve every single day. And so that means you have to say some things to your colleagues that they may not like. You may have to bring things to their attention that they don't want to hear. And some of the work that we've done with teachers have found that some of the most impactful, some of the most transformative teachers are oftentimes the teachers who are on islands. They don't have many friends because they speak truth to their colleagues and they say the things that they know that needs to be said on behalf of our children, and they're not concerned about the backlash or whether or not folks are going to like them because they told them something that they were doing that was harmful to children.
Wow, that's powerful. So it really requires them to, in some ways, be very courageous, because it can then, of course, have an influence on their careers, right? But
absolutely, absolutely, no doubt, no doubt.
But ultimately, the career doesn't matter as much as the students that they're serving.
Absolutely. And that's why you got to be clear about your convictions, about why you choose to do the work, where you choose to do the work, because I maintain if you do real transformative work, you're always swimming upstream. You're always the naysayer. You're always the person who is the contrarian, because you know that you do this work because justice work is never easy. Justice work is never convenient. Justice work oftentimes causes us to go against the grain in all that we do.
Absolutely. So here's one last question for you. And this comes from Sammy Scales, a student who's in the face-to-face course. And the reason I'm asking this question is that a lot of the questions that came out on Twitter were that exact same question about colleagues. But this one says, how do you, it takes a step further, how do you report teachers that are stereotyping and not being, and are being noticeably racist or biased? How do you do that? I think this is asking from a student perspective.
Yeah, you tell their mamas, that's what you do, right? You let them, you tell their grandmamas, you tell them women and those men who you know don't want to see their babies hurt, right? I maintain that the worst thing you can do is get an angry Black mother who knows that something's being done wrong on behalf of her son. That's what you do, because let's be frank, the reality is oftentimes school administrators don't act in ways that are courageous. They protect the damage that's being done to our children. But I think parents are the sleeping giants. We need to start mobilizing parents, caregivers, aunts, uncles, who's ever raising our children, and start to help them to understand some of the things that are happening in schools. And we need to mobilize. We need to be present. We need to have evidence, have our children tell us, okay, tell us what happened first, second, third, fourth. Tell me what you said. Tell me what the teacher said. Tell me how you responded and how the teacher responded accordingly. Get all the information together, and then you go and you present that to a teacher. You present that to an administrator. I think what we have to do, if you're a student, tell the person who is an adult of what you see happening. We have to get the bystander effect to take hold. We have to get folks who watch young people being violated. We have to have young people who are bystanders seeing their peers being disrespected and disregarded. We have to give them protection, because what we know now is that trauma plays itself out in multiple ways. Not only is the person who's the victimizer traumatized, but the bystander can be victimized, can be traumatized as well. And so it just speaks to how the ripple effect can run so deep in terms of how some of our young people are experiencing these racial microaggressions, forms of discrimination, exclusion from learning, and being pushed out of classrooms and being pushed out of schools.
So any last words for those who are either in the face-to-face class or watching online?
Yeah, part of what I would say, and this is really a message to you, Luke, as well. I mean, look, I applaud you, brother, for doing this important work, and I know you have taken a whole lot of scrutiny and a whole lot of criticism for doing this, but you're doing the work that's most important, and you're fighting for the issues that folks don't want to hear, but they need to hear. So I appreciate that, and we have to find ways to support you for doing this work. And I would say the same thing for folks who are advocating for boys of color and black males in particular. Know that when you do it, you're going to be attacked, you're going to be scrutinized, you're going to be called names, you're going to be sort of doubted and questioned. But you have to ask if you are really doing this work for the right reasons. Those factors don't matter. You have to do it because it's just, it's right, and at the end of the day, I think we all benefit when we help our most vulnerable populations, and that's what this is all about. So my thing is, if you do this work, do it for the right reasons. Don't do it for popularity, because that's not what's going to happen. Don't do it for conveniency, because it's never going to be easy, and don't do it for notoriety, because that's not going to come either. You have to do it because you are all in, and your convictions and your commitment and your conscience tells you that this is the work that you feel most important and most committed to doing.
All right. Well, thank you for your time. Round of applause.
Thank you, guys.
I look forward to seeing you soon.
Yes, sir. Look forward to it.
Okay. Bye. All right. And so at this point, we're going to turn to the final element of the live broadcast today. And I had the opportunity prior to the beginning of the actual Black Minds course to speak with a few people who were done in advance, such as Lee Merritt was an interview that was played on the first class. And tonight we also have now an interview that I had the pleasure of doing with Pedro Noguera, who is also coincidentally at UCLA, who is a distinguished professor there who does incredible work, also focused on Black and Latino males in schools. And so we're going to go ahead and turn over to that interview so we can see what he said.
Hello, everyone. I'm joined today by my colleague, Pedro Noguera. Pedro Noguera is a distinguished professor of education in the Graduate School of Education and Information Sciences at UCLA. He is also the director for the Center for the Study of School Transformation. His research focuses on ways in which schools are influenced by social and economic conditions, as well as demographic trends in local, regional, and global contexts. He is the author of 11 books and over 200 articles and monographs. He serves on the boards of numerous national and local organizations and appears as a regular commentator for educational issues on CNN, MSNBC, National Public Radio, and many other news outlets. Hey Pedro, thank you for joining us. Truly appreciate your time, and I'm glad that you're going to be here to help impart some wisdom upon the learners here in the class, including myself. So you've done extensive research looking at Black boys and men in education. For those who may not be as familiar with this topical area as myself, can you talk a little bit about the work that you do and some of the topics and issues that you address?
Sure. So, and thank you for inviting me to participate and join with you on this conversation. I got into this work several years ago, back in the late 80s, kind of right at the height of the crack cocaine epidemic. I was living in the Bay Area. I was teaching at UC Berkeley, and I was also teaching at a high school in the Bay Area that served a continuation high school, served the kids who had been kicked out of the schools. And I was concerned about what I was seeing. I was concerned about what was happening in their lives. I was concerned about the inability of the schools to address their needs. I was seeing the rising levels of violence. And so long before the issues kind of rose to national prominence with my brother's keeper, I was addressing these issues in my own work. I'm a sociologist, and so the way I approach this is trying to understand the different factors that are influencing the lives of young men. And so I'm well aware of the ways in which, for example, chronic unemployment shapes both the aspirations of young men, but also the kinds of opportunities that are available to them. When I was doing the work, it was a major factor in influencing their involvement in the drug trade, because there weren't a lot of viable other alternatives in terms of jobs available. But I was equally concerned with why the schools that were supposed to be serving these young people were failing so miserably at that. The disconnect between the teachers and these students, the ways in which the intelligence that I saw manifest to young men was not acknowledged or even seen in the schools they served. And so that drove me to further look at what could be done to close that gap, the gap between the way schools saw and served this population and the ways in which the young men themselves had adopted the position as non-learners, kind of become so alienated from school that it became very difficult to reach them in a school setting.
So you talked a little bit about what led you to your research in this area. What are, in terms of your motivation, what are some of the kinds of thinking that you've sought to advance in your work in terms of strategies and practices and sense-making that you think is necessary for improving outcomes for this population?
So the way I start is by pointing out to people that the problems confronting Black males in America are not simply educational. Education is just one area where they manifest in terms of higher dropout rates, higher discipline referrals, higher special ed placements, etc. But those problems are also present in the labor market. You know, Black males being more likely to be unemployed, more likely to be discriminated against, more likely to be held down into low-wage jobs. Yeah. And then you also see a number of health challenges in terms of heart disease, high blood pressure, various kinds of cancer, including colon cancer. And so when you start to look at this picture from the health, the educational, the criminal justice, and the education standpoint, you recognize that the problem is much, much bigger than it's often portrayed. I refer to it much more like a syndrome. It's a complex because it's an array of problems, and that means that you can't think in terms of a single solution to address those problems, because the problems are not located in simply one domain or arena. It's a little bit, the analogy I would make is AIDS, right? If you think about it, AIDS is the acquired immune deficiency syndrome, right? That is that we know there's a virus at work, but when the virus says it affects the immune system, right, and makes people vulnerable to secondary illnesses like pneumonia, that's often what kills people, not the virus itself. And if you think of the crisis facing or the array of the chronic problems facing Black males, because they do cut across all these domains, what we really have to think about is not so much is there a silver bullet solution, but rather how do you rebuild support systems like an immune system that would protect young men and boys, I would say particularly when they're young, so that you can prevent a lot of the problems, but even as they're older, so that if for example, if a person is incarcerated, they don't get re-incarcerated later. If a person's in school, we keep them in school. We put them on a track to college, so that you're thinking strategically how to build support systems in place for young men and boys.
So you mentioned that there's no silver bullet. So I've heard a friend one time said that there's no silver bullet but a silver buckshot, recognizing that there's multiple strategies that have to take place. What are some of the solutions that you see that are evidence-based that need to take place from these different vantage points?
Well, I just did a paper that I would refer you to. It's put out by a group called RISE, University of Pennsylvania. Did a whole series of policy briefs, and I did one that looks at this. And so for example, here's one thing that would really make sense and is very practical: early intervention, right? If, for example, we were committed to making sure that all boys, Black boys, were reading by the age of 7 or 8, that would have some big long-term benefits in terms of academically, but just in terms of overall well-being, because people who are more educated earn more money, they're healthier, they have better life outcomes. So early intervention programs, quality preschool, is a huge part of this picture. Beyond that, I think you have to involve young people themselves in the development of strategies and solutions. And I say that because if you don't hear from the voices from the young men, a lot of times the programs that are set up to serve them don't meet their needs and end up being a waste of time. We need to find out directly from young men the kinds of services they need, and they need to be involved in developing those. Yeah. I'm on the board of an organization called Brotherhood Sister Soul in New York City, which has been doing this kind of work in this way for 21 years. And young people are involved in the leadership of that organization, and its track record is extremely successful. So when you look at programs that have done this work well, what you see is that the voice and the perspective of young people is central to the work itself. Lastly, I think you have to involve their parents and the broader community, because you need to involve adult stakeholders in this work and not think that institutions by themselves can figure out how to raise boys. Families raise boys. Churches need to play a role. Nonprofits, Boys and Girls Clubs. We need to involve the community much more directly, and where there are no community organizations, we need to think about how to develop them. And so, this way, I mean that we need to approach it from many different angles if we're going to have an impact.
And so you mentioned parents. If you were to give advice to parents about how to best raise young black boys and to become men, what would you recommend?
Well, the first thing, again, is to read to them when they're small, to develop their literacy skills at home, and to develop the relationship. And what's, I think, particularly important for parents is the relationship has to evolve. As a child gets older, the relationship with their parents have to evolve. A lot of parents struggle with teenagers because the child is growing, but they haven't changed the way they treat the child, and so the relationship becomes more strained when the child enters adolescence. And so maintaining strong, positive relationships with your children is the most important thing parents can do, so they continue to have influence on those children and can guide them.
Okay, thank you. Now let's turn, because you talked about these different communities that have responsibility. Can we talk a little bit about educators? And from your perspective as a sociologist, what are some things that educators can do tomorrow to help improve success for this population?
Well, the first thing they can do is start looking at their data, which will tell them where they're losing the boys. That is, which classrooms have the highest number of referrals, either for special education or for discipline, because those are teachers usually that need help, because they have very weak and strained relationships with boys and need training on how to build those relationships. We need to look more carefully at the kinds of support systems in schools. Are there mentors for boys who don't have fathers at home or whose parents might be incarcerated? Those boys, we know, are much more likely to get into trouble. Kids in foster care, kids in group homes need more guidance and more support. If you know a child doesn't have adult supervision and support at home, then we need to make sure they're getting it either at school or in the community. So looking at your data will help in giving you a picture of which children are most vulnerable and which children need to be targeted with more support. Beyond that, I think you need to think about ways to make the boys feel like they're part of the school. When kids are involved in music, in sports, in theater, where there's a strong sense of belonging, kids do better academically. The kids who are most at risk tend to be most alienated and most estranged from school. So we need to think, okay, how do we make kids feel like they're part of the school and its culture so that they can be more successful?
Absolutely, because otherwise they'll develop a sense of belonging in something that's not connected to school, and that will even further that disassociation, right?
That's right.
So can you talk a little bit about recommendations now, again, looking at different communities for administrators? What can they do to better support this population? Is it some of the same things that you recommended for teachers, or does that look a little different for them?
Well, I think, they do have to spend a lot of time looking at their school itself and the culture of that school, looking at the teacher-student relationships, working on those. But then beyond the school, they need to look at who their community partners are, because chances are they don't have enough African-American male mentors, adult mentors on campus, because we know in most schools that there's the shortage of black male teachers. So do you have partnerships with local civic organizations, with churches, that can help you in addressing the needs of boys? And so I would say that school administrators need to be resourceful, need to be connected to their communities, need to do outreach and build partnerships so that they're not doing this work by themselves.
Absolutely. So this particular course focuses on the connection between the Black Lives Movement and Black Minds research, focusing particularly on criminalization and undervaluing that takes place in society, but also influences how Black boys and men are treated in education. In your work, have you seen any connection between those concepts and what we see in schooling?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Black Lives Matter movement has just raised and elevated and drawn our attention to the fact that many boys, Black boys, are targeted for punishment, targeted by law enforcement very early for relatively minor offenses, and sometimes for nothing at all, simply for being boys. And what we need is to go beyond kind of raising awareness about the issue, which is important but not sufficient. We need to make sure that we're holding police departments accountable for the way in which they interact with our communities and with our boys. We also need to make sure that schools are enacting alternatives to punitive discipline, because we know that very punitive discipline practices often are the starting point for initiating children, particularly Black boys, on a school to prison pipeline. Kids who get punished are usually not in school, more likely to get in trouble, and more likely to interact with law enforcement. So I'd say, again, you need to look at this in multiple ways, but I think what Black Lives Matter has done is been to raise our awareness about the problem. Now we need solutions that are put in place to address the problem of both mass incarceration and the disproportionate discipline that we see Black boys being subjected to in schools.
Now you said punishing boys for being boys. What does that mean?
Well, it's common in many schools. You see Black boys engaging in horseplay, for example. Because it's Black boys, the reaction of the adults tends to be much more alarmed and much more invoke a greater sense of fear than if it was a group of white boys or a group of white girls doing the same behavior. And so, heightened awareness about the fact that kids are kids, that they do need guidance and support and structure, but at the same time they don't need punitive forms of punishment for relatively minor infractions. And what we see in many schools is that in response to fairly minor infractions, kids are being sent home, suspended for long periods of time, which then exacerbates the fact that many of those kids are not learning and become even more alienated from school.
Excellent.
Black minds matter because Black people have always made a contribution to American society. And when you don't tap into the talent of the Black minds, the country as a whole is at a loss. There is a wealth of talent amongst Black children, and that talent needs to be developed in schools that support them, that challenge them, that stimulate them, because our next scientists, artists, writers are waiting for their opportunity to receive an education that allow those skills and abilities to be born.
We were joined by Pedro Noguera. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Luke.
All right, hey, thank you. Truly appreciate it. I owe you. If you ever need anything, just let me know.
All right.
Okay, so we're going to end our class tonight with a few questions. And what we're hoping is that as you're watching this from wherever you're at, if you're in a group, you can have a conversation around these questions. We certainly will be. And if you're watching this as an individual, then at least you'll start to engage in your own kind of critical reflection about these questions. So bear in mind the incredible presentations that we had today from Dr. Savage, Dr. Howard, and Dr. Noguera. Here are some questions that we want you to think about. And if you want, you can take a picture of your screen so you can keep them for yourself. So what are some insights you gleaned from tonight's conversation? What are some things that you learned today that you didn't know yesterday? What are assumptions of criminality, which I began with at the top of the session, but was clearly a theme throughout all the presentations, and how do they influence the experiences of Black boys and men? How do classroom management practices adversely affect Black boys and men? And a question that came up repeatedly through social media and in this class was, when we see things taking place that shouldn't be, how do we hold other educators accountable for the way that they treat, engage, and talk about our Black boys and men? And finally, and possibly most importantly, what can you do tomorrow to help change the paradigm that we see? Again, this class is focused on creating a civil resistance in the classroom. And what that has referred to is embracing a new educational paradigm that empowers our students and communicates love? These questions, I think, will help us engage in some sense-making to get to that point. And lastly, before we close, I did want to mention that quote, it's not the silver bullet, but the silver buckshot. I said in the video it was for a friend because I hadn't remembered at what time. Who actually said that? It was our Dean of Students here at San Diego State University, Dr. Randy Tim, who said that during his dissertation defense, and it's always stuck with me. And if you listen to Dr. Noguera, one of the things that was very evident is he talked about just the confluence of factors that are really facing this population. So there's no one way that's going to basically change everything. It's a confluence of multiple strategies that take into account that our Black boys and men are being affected in many ways, inside the classroom, outside the classroom, in our culture, in the curriculum, in classroom management, in the ways that we view them. So it can't just be one myopic approach, but a multifaceted approach to improve their success. Thank you for joining us this evening, and hopefully we will see you next week.